Dissent. And today's guest is Myriam Hadnes, behavioral economist and podcaster. So welcome to the show, Myriam.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And today's assumption, today's idea is the idea that we should know what we're doing or know what you're doing. And I think perhaps if you're like me, you've always wanted to answer the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years with? I don't know. No idea. And despite that being the most honest response, it doesn't seem to be usually what people want to hear. Doesn't get very good response sometimes.
It's comforting for many. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that discomfort is a really big part of it, and I'm really looking forward to kind of digging into this a bit more today. But if you happen to be new to Delightful Dissent, this show is a shared exploration of ideas that people tend to take for granted and that don't really get the examination that I think they should. It's the idea for the show came about through my work with people taking pioneering approaches to big and complex problems and doing things differently. And Myriam is very much one of those people. I found that there are kind of these hidden barriers, these things that come up with implicit beliefs and the deeper assumptions around things that get in the way. And I wanted to challenge some of those and bring them to light. So I hope this show gives you specific ideas about how you can, that will help you in your professional and personal life, potentially. But perhaps more importantly, to give you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge some assumptions and ideas yourself. Because really, I'd like to see everyone being able to do this regularly. And the show is called Delightful Dissent because we are kind of going against the grain and maybe disagreeing with the conventional view. But it's not about proving ourselves right at the expense of everyone else. It's not about taking this incredibly seriously. It's about having some fun and playing with some ideas and seeing where we end up. This show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if there are any technical issues. And please be aware that we may be talking about some challenging and personal topics. The ones that are likely to come up today are related to uncertainty and perhaps to loss of identity or loss of certainty around identity. We may also use strong language, so if that's an issue, then please be warned that we may possibly do that. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is absolutely about exploring and about asking questions of yourself and of each other and of us. If you're watching live, you can ask questions and engage in the chat, and we'll try and bring those in. If you're watching or listening to the recordings, then I'll be sharing more information about how you can get in touch with either of us at the end of the show to continue that conversation. So, I was introduced to Myriam, I think, but actually by next week's guest, by strange coincidence, by Sharon Lee. And we had a really just lovely conversation, but I was particularly struck by Myriam's ability to really move between and around ideas and yet connect them with something deeper and more felt as well, which I thought was really, really lovely. And so I'm really, really pleased to have you on the show, Myriam. Could I ask you to introduce yourself a little bit as well, please?
Sure. So you introduced me as a behavioral economist and a podcast host, and I think that's the easy part. So I have a PhD in behavioral economics, so that's my academic background. Used to work in academia for my entire life until I quit, started my own journey, started calling myself maybe a searcher, then called myself a facilitator, then moved now into community building and more into training of facilitators. So I basically help organizations and people leaders to leverage the power of groups through facilitation.
Thank you. And could you tell me maybe a little bit more about the people that you really like to work with in that context?
I think I enjoy working with those who are comfortable with not knowing the answer and who are curious enough to explore. So I think my core belief is that we all know already, which basically exactly contradicts what we're talking about today, but somehow it doesn't. So I do believe that groups have everything they need in order to come up with an answer, whether it's the right answer or not. And the power of facilitators, or the skill of a facilitator, is to bring forth and to leverage this deeper knowledge. And I think, yeah, I enjoy working with people who share the same belief and the trust in those who gather around the table to have a conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that experience of trust, of mutual trust, is such a powerful part of this work. How is it you came from behavioral economics to this? What is it that made you feel like you wanted to go off on a slightly different path?
I moved from research, core academia, to educational program development and coordination, to higher education strategy. And then in the strategy part, I was confronted with group dynamics, with workshops, with bottom-up strategy building and execution, and how it can go wrong and how it can go right. And I realized that this need for a mindset of people that I enjoy working with is maybe not as apparent in the public sector. So, and I just had bigger dreams, I guess. So I thought that I have to step out of that and to explore other options. And then on the journey of self-exploration, I started to host idea parties that today I would call maybe a mastermind. So it was a meetup. I invited people to come with a problem and then to brainstorm together on a solution. There was beer provided and sticky notes provided. And somehow this turned into a facilitation career. Back then, I didn't even know what a facilitator was. And then people asked me to design their workshops and to facilitate them. And then they hired me to design their workshops without facilitating them. I'm like, oh, there clearly is a business opportunity here.
I think it's a really interesting one, and for me, it plays directly to this: know what you're doing, and the planning thing. Is I've had the majority of successes I've had as well were kind of weirdly unexpected. I just did a thing because I kind of wanted the thing. It's like, I want this to be here. Who wants in?
And I think then the invitation that you're making in these situations and the non-attachment to the outcome, I think, is almost a prerequisite for success. Given that you're patient and keep on going, maybe.
I think for me, the way I think about it is that when we have one very specific outcome in mind, we have to control that very tightly to hit that outcome. But there are very many good outcomes in the field of possibility around that. Some of them are better outcomes as well. And if we can be more fluid with where we're going with it and responsive to what comes up, we can actually kind of angle towards better outcomes. And we don't have to labor so much if this very specific outcome that we had in mind suddenly becomes unavailable or hard to achieve.
Yeah, and what comes to my mind is, what does better outcome mean? I mean, we don't know until the outcome is there. And even once it's there, since we don't have the counterfactual, there's only one world that we can experience. We don't know whether it was the best outcome or a better outcome. So maybe in our podcast interview on my show, where you were a guest, you were very specific about safe enough instead of safe space, and maybe good enough is the term to apply here.
I think that idea, actually, particularly in an organizational context, the idea of satisficing is a really important one. And so you make me think of this, the idea that actually the people who have the best mental health outcomes also happen to usually satisfice in their lives rather than trying to kind of completely optimize. Yet in organizations, we still very often seem to be in this like utter optimization, win, dominate, control approach, which for me really doesn't work in complex environments.
And it feels, I totally agree. And it feels to me as the best comparison is a mosquito itch, that it feels so satisfying to keep scratching, although it's a worst thing that you can do. And with control, so you want so desperately to control and predict an outcome. And it feels in the moment so satisfactory, although as more as you control, the longer you scratch, the worse the result.
Absolutely. No, I think that's such a good metaphor for so many organizational situations I found myself in. So yeah. Before we really get into it, though we kind of have started already, do you have a quote that you'd like to share with us on this topic?
Yes, and we already touched upon it. So it's a quote by David Hume, and he said that all knowledge degenerates into probability eventually. So, and I picked up David Hume while reading a book about quantum physics, which then relates to the topic that we just discussed, that we don't know the counterfactual. So once we experience something, then it is an experience and it's knowledge. But everything that is future is just a probability because we don't know and we cannot control. So I thought that David Hume, although very old philosopher, still is still very applicable to this topic.
It's interesting to see those ideas as a thread through, because I sometimes feel that there's this turn towards uncertainty in science at the beginning of the 20th century and in philosophy, actually, with, you have things like quantum theory and the difficulty of that being accepted even by incredibly brilliant people like Einstein. I think it's important to point out that this is hard cognitively, particularly if you've got these really strong ideas and models. The Einstein's quote about God does not play dice is like, well, yes, but no.
Maybe.
And then you have Russell's paradox, and you have Bertrand Russell and all of the work around logic and how certain you can be about things on a categorical level, and that's fundamentally you can't. There are limits to that. And then you get Gödel and Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which generalizes that to everything. So you've got these fundamental ideas that we can't have that level of certainty from within the paradigm of science and logic. Yet it's still valuable, but it's constrained. And I think for me that, the idea of constraint, it's always probability, it's always a model, it's always uncertain to some degree, is absolutely key to engaging with this idea of knowing what you're doing. But how about you? What made you want to bring that quote in? How does it feel?
I was looking for something or a quote that would bring a different perspective in the conversation. So the knowing what you're doing, as we discussed about it, was related to our businesses, and also for me, it's related to a degree of perfection. So if I know what I'm doing, or if I have the expectation to know what I'm doing, then by definition, I will do the very best. So I will try to achieve a perfect outcome. And this puts a lot of pressure because what is perfect anyway? So the moment when we're not knowing what we're doing, it gives a little bit more slack, a little bit more space for creativity. But then, yeah, how do we go about it? So what's the role of knowledge and what's the role of experience? And I think David Hume just brings these two perfectly together.
Yeah, hearing you speak about that, it makes me think, I think the fear that sometimes comes up when we talk about uncertainty is that it means that we have we cannot know. We have no kind of traction at all. It's complete unknowing. And uncertainty is the space between knowing and unknowing. It's not that we don't know at all, and it's not that we know completely. So probability is essentially is a mathematical expression of exactly that. And I think the fact that we can use that and work with that feels like a really, really important part of this, and the work, of facilitation and is in many ways, and it feels like an exploration of that. Is why, if you knew what you were doing, why would you need facilitation on some level?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, that's very true. Because as soon as you bring more than two people together, you don't know what's going to happen, because group dynamics, there are just so many different factors. And I think the mindset of a facilitator is really to thrive in that space. So to have intentions, a purpose, surely a plan, and still being open to any outcome that might occur, because you don't know. And I think it's actually funny that as human beings, although uncertainty has been around or is the key factor of being human, we don't know how the future will turn out. It is so scary and threatening on an ontological basis, that I think we're just by nature trying everything and anything to reduce it, which then reduces the capacity for creativity, for collaboration, or even could lead to social anxiety. Because the best way to reduce or to have knowledge of what will happen is not to interact with anyone.
Absolutely. And I think for me, actually, my own experience is as someone who is really enjoys uncertainty. Until very recently, I didn't understand how much I enjoy uncertainty and how little others do, or many others do. And that actually, for me, a lot of my social anxiety and my difficulties is that I'll kind of find it without even, because I enjoy it. I want to be playing with this stuff. And for a lot of people, that is a deeply threatening thing. And I never really understood that, because I don't feel that threat. And I think you're absolutely right. This idea of a concrete certainty is, my lived experience of the world just isn't that. But I think it is for a lot of people. They have that kind of foundation about this is this, and this causes this, and that and challenges to that ontological threat. That idea of my worldview becoming incoherent and not being able to recover from that is a very real fear for a lot of people.
Yes, totally. And I wonder, I would like to come back to so yes, it's a real fear, because I think we derive pleasure from expected future outcomes. So by expecting to have a beautiful dinner, or having a beautiful family or marriage or whatsoever, then we start enjoying it from the first date. And then if there's no second date, we feel suffering for the marriage that has never happened and the children that never happened.
The loss of the imagined future. Yeah,
exactly. On the other hand, I wonder to what extent or what kind of uncertainty we are speaking about. Because I think it's like with change. I think that almost everyone enjoys change that we have decided for ourselves. Oh, I'm going to cut my hair. I'm going to change my routines. I will change the interior of my house. And I think nobody enjoys change that is put upon or forced upon them. Organizational change, loss of job, relationships, loved ones. So I wonder what kind of uncertainty and what degree of routine or certainty you might still enjoy in that. Because speaking for myself, if I had a meeting with my advisory board for the community that I manage. And they told me, Myriam, where do you see never done before in 5 years, maybe in 50 years? And I got shivers and just wanted to run away. I was like, I don't even know what it will look like in 1 year. So I like this uncertainty and building from it. On the other hand, I have in my daily life such strict routines, and we talked about that before.
Both of us were so similar in that way. It's a strange relationship to have that need for structure and a need for uncertainty. And
So on a micro level, just to finish the thought, on a micro level, the uncertainty, not knowing where we'll get my coffee in the morning or whether or not I can fulfill my morning routine, puts me totally off. Whereas the macro uncertainty of, I don't know where the money will come from next year, might be less threatening for me than for others.
Yeah, I think this idea of, this relationship to planning and the plannable and what we are comfortable with in these spaces is a really interesting one, because just like you, I very much enjoy a very high degree of a certain sort of uncertainty, but also feel very disrupted if my day, like I have rhythms and patterns that I really struggle with if they're not, if they don't happen, and I kind of get lost a little bit. And I think perhaps there's the way I think about it is I tend to think about it as rhythm in improvised music is that I need a backbeat to stay anchored, but that gives me the freedom to kind of go all twiddling improvising on top, but without it all kind of collapses in on itself. And I think there is, and it's a really interesting thing to talk about, because for me, I think a lot of this is there are certain just skills that we achieve. Part of this is there are skills and abilities that we learn that are effective ways of doing this. If you look at the people who can deal with a very high degree of uncertainty, very often they are also very high in controlling what they can control.
Yes,
it makes me think, it's like what don't we control, and what do we control? And I think of sports performance psychology actually in this. It's like, and being able to hold those two things as separate and kind of sometimes almost contradictory feels like one of the kind of cognitive, maybe metacognitive skills around like being able to engage well with what do I do when I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and to be very clear on just accepting what we cannot control. And then to shift the mindset. Yeah, so mental agility almost. And I think that even in the educational system, we're not trained for this not knowing. So at university, it's all about getting a specialized degree, whereas nowadays, a specialization today will almost for sure be totally outdated in a few years from now. So where is the meaning and the value of such a generalization and specialization?
And I think that's a really, really important point, that I sometimes differentiate training and education. Think of training to a specific end and education to be the more general kind of meta thing. And it feels like up until now, we've kind of been satisfied that by training people, they would become educated. That feels like the assumption, whereas actually I don't believe that's either. Maybe it was never true, or maybe it's simply because we're in with just the intensity of the complexity and the interconnectedness of the situation we're in now means that we need the skill to a higher degree to be able to engage, because things are changing faster. If I think a generation ago, you could walk into a job, you could train, do a degree and walk into a job and retire from that job, and that was a common experience.
Yeah,
that isn't a common experience anymore. And so that kind of change, I think, is a really interesting part of it, and how do we prepare? Because I think that's, and again, actually, this relates to the facilitation as a skill, and the perhaps even the self-facilitation, which I think might be an interesting thing to talk about. So does that resonate for you?
Yes. Yes, in a way that, okay, there are different layers to unpack. So the training versus education. Training almost sounds like a skill set that you acquire that helps you to solve a specific problem or task. Whereas education would rather be a way how to see and interpret the world.
I tend to think of that there being a class of things around, I think of as capability building, rather than like problem solving, specific problem solving.
Yeah. And I agree that we do need a different approach to this acquiring or learning in the future, where it's rather about how to ask the right questions that we're really curious about, and then reflecting and being open to all different kinds of answers in order to make sure that we are not biased or we are not falling into any of the biases or into a filter bubble, that we are open to sit with discomfort as soon as an answer might contradict our initial beliefs. And hence, all of these different skills that we need are what I would call core facilitation skills. Asking the right questions, neutrality, openness to different answers, and then the ability to sense make and to bring it together. So, yes, I honestly believe that if our leaders were better facilitators, the world would be a better place.
I'm inclined to agree, and though from my perspective, like to take a step back from that is to think about what systems would put strong facilitators in place as leaders. I think this is one of the really big questions: is why we have there's a selection, a systemic selection effect. Why do we mistake? Why do we think when someone confidently says they know what they are doing? Why do we take their word for it? When even repeatedly, when that's demonstrated as untrue, it's this. There's something about the way certain people present themselves and present ideas that seems to bypass this in many people, and they're just like, oh, I can trust you to do. I can put. It almost feels like I can give my discomfort with uncertainty to you to handle.
Yes.
And that's such a human desire. I think that's such an understandable desire, particularly when we're feeling close to overwhelm or feeling scared or angry or anything that we feel uncomfortable feeling, and that we can hand it off to someone else and let them handle it. And I think for me, the experiences of certainly politically the last 6 or 7 years are that doing that has had a significant number of where people have done that, they haven't got what they wanted out of it at all.
And I wonder whether there is a paradigm shift that still needs to happen, where and I'm thinking out loud, but it came to my mind where I heard you speaking why fewer facilitators are in the leader's role. And it seems to me that in the past, we asked questions because we didn't know the answers. So back in the days, the library or the church were the only places where there was knowledge. So we had to go to the place. Not everyone could read. So in order to acquire knowledge, we had to ask questions. Today, answers and knowledge is abundant. So we can get it from everywhere. So asking questions is no longer for acquiring knowledge, but for expanding our own perspective. So back in the day, if someone asked questions, meant they don't know. today, if someone asks a question, doesn't mean that they don't know, but that they're curious to know more and to have different perspectives. And I think this kind of shift hasn't yet, how to say it, arrived in the selection of leaders, or maybe even in our just intrinsic way of seeing, acknowledging leaders, that when someone asks a question, our brain still tells us, oh, stupid person, not a leader.
I think there's, for me, it's almost, it feels as well that things are, that what's embedded in the ideas that are embedded in our institutions and our tools and our ways of doing this are part of this, is to, you know, there's this fundamental thing where there's I think it's a W. Edwards Deming quote that around that a system is perfectly designed to create the outcomes which it does. And I think it's, you know, so it's like, if those aren't the outcomes that you want, then look at the design of the system. And for me, a lot of it comes down to that, and it's like, yeah, there's a huge shift in terms of how we do this. And I think there are some, you know, organizational systems and political systems that are further ahead than this, and some that are further behind. And I think it shows very obviously. And when those institutions encounter big uncertain, big unexpected events, unanticipated events, because it feels like a lot of this is around our ability to predict and anticipate reliably, or perhaps around and perhaps the fundamental assumption with this idea of knowing what you're doing is that we can predict perfectly. You know, that perfect prediction is trivial, that we'll know what we want, that we can know what we want, and we can know how to get it ahead of time, which is trivially disprovable. And the psychology literature is full of this stuff around like how bad we are at working out how we will feel in a certain situation in the future. It's amazing how poor we are about it.
We try.
And how convinced we are that we're going to be right as well. It's that disconnect. It's like, this is going to be brilliant. This is going to be, so yeah. When you actually get there. And I'm talking about the bias, but like any bias, knowing about it does not mean you're not subject to it. And it's a huge thing for me. You know, I get very like kind of obsessive about a certain idea or a certain thing and bringing it about. And then it's like,
yes. And as you spoke, I was just wondering whether it's a future feature of a capitalistic society, that the prediction and the aim to know the outcomes and to predict and to calculate, because there's a specific gain and it's a constant gamble, and it's all about accumulating wealth. In capitalistic, in communist or socialistic societies or systems, the planning and prediction is equally important, but for different means. It's more for distribution. And then there's maybe a different way of attachment to it. And they try to create certainty, maybe to the extreme, which doesn't mean that it works. Even they failed. But then I would think that maybe then societies that are more independent of capitalistic systems, or maybe former more social community-based societies, that maybe they are more comfortable with uncertainty in general, because they rely on nature and the natural cycle and don't even try to control, because they know that Mother Nature in the end decides when something happens.
I think there's definitely a couple of different layers to play within there. I certainly think that that one of the consequences, I don't think it's a direct consequence of capitalism as a general concept, but of the way that we do capitalism, particularly in the West and particularly in the Anglo-American context, is that it very much pulls us away from nature and our nature. It's very abstracting in all senses, and that leads us to certain mindsets and certain approaches that aren't very good at dealing with this uncertainty and the complexity. And relatedly, for me, I think, if you look at what capitalism does well, is it answers a question very efficiently. However, it says nothing about the value of that question. So, and that's why we have, why capitalism can give us amazingly and useful things, and really kind of perfectly executed, useless and harmful things. Because that's what it does. It does the perfect execution side really, really well, but does nothing about whether or not that thing should exist.
Yes, it's not about the moral judgment. It's about allocation.
And worse, it kind of loops back on itself, and then it becomes this thing of like, what makes the most money is the good thing. And I think for me, that loop back is when it becomes this kind of myopic, it's stuck in its own ontology, and we need to step outside. So I think for me, it's yes, capitalism delivers really efficiently. That's what it does. But the effect of what is delivered, that it doesn't say anything or have any relation to that one way or the other, good, bad, effective, not effective. It doesn't touch that. And we need to consider and build that in too.
And I think, because it's to circle back to our initial question, because in capitalistic systems, those are compensated or remunerated who can best predict or know what they're doing, predict the outcome. And therefore, there's a lot of kind of ambition to bridge this uncertainty and to control uncertainty, although we cannot.
Yeah, so it's rewarded.
Rewarded. Thank you. This was the word I was looking for.
Yeah, and I think relatedly, and this is one of the weird things as well, because I think for me, where you do see real value created through capitalism, it's very often because people are willing to engage with uncertainty and then realize that into the system. So I think the idea that they're kind of antagonists, uncertainty and certainty, and that's one of the problems with this whole way of thinking. It's like you get to knowing what you're doing by not knowing what you're doing. Yeah. If you can't step outside of the knowing what you're doing, you're only ever going to operate within that one context. And when things shift around you, you're not going to be able to keep up.
Yes, which circles back to what you said in the very beginning of our conversation, that when you already know what you're doing, then it's boring and you won't be successful and create something meaningful. And the beauty of capitalism, or even our globalized world, buzzword alarm, is that whenever we dare to step outside, it will have an immediate impact. And if it resonates with someone, then something will happen. And then there is an effect that is truly greater than us. But I think maybe the pandemic is one of the most interesting examples of what can happen when we lean into a situation that was a global unknown for everyone and suddenly created new opportunities for everyone because we started to communicate in different ways in real time.
Yeah, I think there's a very real possibility that we wouldn't be having this conversation today if it hadn't been for the pandemic, for all sorts of reasons. Yeah, and it's one of the very interesting things. I think for me, one of the fascinating things about the pandemic is to see it through the lens of emergence and see the pandemic itself as an emergent property above society. It's like, it's not something that like was directly caused by any one thing. Certainly the experience of the pandemic. Yes, there were certain kind of individual causal bits, but they were all probabilistic actually. And there's this really interesting in this is like, so by force of numbers, it was very likely to come about in the way that it did, because if it hadn't emerged on that day in that place, something very similar would have emerged a couple of weeks later in another place. And if the person who got that thing hadn't then passed it on to someone else, then they might have passed it on to the next person. And so it would have the exact form would have been slightly different, but the fact that it came about is just likely from the way that everything functions. And we found, that to stop it, we had to shut down so much of stuff because it was this emergent thing. That was a really fascinating, terrifying and fascinating thing to engage with. It's like all of these things that have become completely normal, that we are completely, like, international travel, within national travel, going to work, all of these completely normal things, going out and buying food from this international supply chain that we rely upon. Suddenly we were like, if we do this, we are going to catch this. We are going to have a really significant chance of us and other people catching this disease that could well kill us. And so it becomes a really interesting thing of like, all of this emerged on top. And for me, like, part of knowing what you're doing in this context is knowing the context. It's not just the individual thing, it's what emerges as a result of all of the things around the thing. Because I think this is the other part of it for me, is we can get very focused on a single goal, particularly organizationally, particularly in a workplace context. And like, part of when I say, the real knowing what you're doing is understanding the context in which you're operating too.
So it's basically a systems thinking way, and then it's about knowing about the implications of what you're doing, knowing about the impact or the potential impact, or the different variables and degrees of freedom.
And I think the other part of this is also, is being open about what you know and what you don't know. And for me, this is probably my favorite facilitation trick. Is like this assumption that facilitators kind of have to know everything and handle everything. It's like most of the time, what you actually learn is ways to handle what you don't know when you're learning it as a practice.
And to trust that the group as an entity will know somehow or come up with something that is close to knowing. And I wonder, to come back to relate, since you're saying this now, facilitation skills or facilitation to leadership. I think that one missed opportunity of the pandemic was the leadership not having admitted that they didn't know what they were doing. Although, how could someone possibly expect that? But I think there's a missed opportunity of stepping into exactly the space that you just described, of saying, I don't know, let's explore, or at least admitting that they don't know.
I think that's such a powerful act in leadership. I think it's also worth noting that in some leadership positions it will get you removed. But if someone is in that context, is feeling like they want to be able to acknowledge some of this, how might they go about it? What could they do to really bring in others to the conversation, to facilitate as a leader?
I think it starts with a open and genuine question. And it reminds me of Ray Dalio, who wrote this book, Principles, and has these fantastic YouTube videos. And he always says that he wants to surround himself with intelligent people who disagree with him. and not to be convinced or to learn from them, but just to be able to see the world through their eyes. And I think what leaders, not only leaders, any one of us, can do more, me included, is to surround ourselves with loving critics, those who people we respect for their intelligence and who have a totally different point of view. And it's painful, it's discomfortable, and it is a fantastic learning opportunity, and maybe the only way how leaders can truly take the best decisions.
Yeah, I really like that, the idea of challenging, seeking challenge, seeking invalidation in a sense, as well as and I think Ray Dalio, I think he explicitly talks about that kind of thing, and it's interesting that his organization managed to benefit and predict significant uncertainty that was otherwise unpredicted, and it's a really, really interesting position to be in, and for me, always being pulled towards this kind of uncertainty. I think there is also an assumption for me that certainly that I've kind of carried for a long time, that I couldn't be this and be a leader.
Mm. Mhm. Be a leader or be recognized as a leader, or to lead. Because I think you can be a leader without wearing the label of a leader or without being called a leader. And then you can still be recognized as a leader.
I think it's for me, it's more that recognition can feel very uncomfortable. Is that idea of like, I've often expressed it as like, don't follow me, I don't know where I'm going. And yet people still do. And it doesn't act like, if I let that go and be open about it, it seems to work out really, really well. But I have that fear, I definitely do. There's that like people will look to me for stuff that I can't answer, or I don't, and that will then be kind of on me. Which does make me think some of this is around the promises that we make to others, and this is about being frank about what we are aware of and what we are not aware of.
And maybe that's true leadership, to be followed although we don't know where we are going.
Which is really, in such strong juxtaposition to the idea of leadership as hiring someone or following someone to achieve a specific outcome.
Yeah. And I think when we look at those very successful companies recently, when we look at or the leaders like Elon Musk, he might be controversial. He doesn't pretend to know where he's going, what he's doing. He has some visions. He has some very big goals. Or Bezos, Amazon, they're continuously reinventing themselves. Maybe not the most charismatic or loved leader, but definitely playing with the space of not knowing.
I think it's fascinating to see really big organizations that have become big through experimentation and change. And it makes me think of how Google approach things as well. And this idea of, in tech, is to launch a product and then shut it down is considered shameful and a failure. Whereas Google just do it to find out stuff. There are so many Google products that are just like, well, we did it for a bit. We found out some stuff. We're going to turn it off now. And I think that idea of, being willing to experiment, perhaps this is, like knowing what you're doing. One of the really big, and this relates to actually another episode recently, was the idea of changing one's mind. Changing your mind is like that fear of is like, okay, I thought I knew what it was doing, and something else has changed. Something has changed that. And both seeking those experiences and integrating them, being frank about them, and like working with them instead of pretending that they don't exist, which is so often the response, feels like a huge part of this. And so not being worried about, but conversely letting go of that specific outcome, that's what we don't have to do anymore. We don't have to worry that the outcome is not exactly what it was when we started.
Yes, which is actually the natural outcome of our times, where we constantly accumulate so much data and information that we didn't have before. And I actually wonder what the impact of knowing what you're doing is, or what AI is on this catchphrase, knowing what you're doing, where suddenly there's so much information and machines learning from the past to potentially predict the future. To what extent would it then become a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that there might be less impact or less possibility of just experimentation? And I'm thinking out loud. It's just a thought that popped up in my mind. It's like inflation. So the moment everyone believes in inflation, there will be inflation. So it's It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. To what extent do you believe this could become the case with AI?
I think for me, in both these contexts, in the knowing what you're doing, leadership type context, and in AI, we're talking about decision making. Ultimately, AI is a term that's used in ways I don't think it's a helpful label, actually. I think it's much more helpful to refer to the kind of technology that we use at the moment as automated decision making, because that's really what it is. And that can be really efficient. That can be really, really helpful. It can make decisions, it can process far more data than any human can process, or certain types of data. It can be free of the biases, the cognitive biases that we all necessarily use for cognition. However, it can also have all of those biases embedded in it as it's designed and in how it is trained. So the training set will contain all of the systemic bias that already exists in the system. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to be aware of what we are automating and why.
Because the system, as you say, will never be able to forecast something that hasn't been there before. So if there was never a female or a Black leader, the system won't even get the idea that this is even possible, because everything is based on the data it's fed with.
And more perniciously than that, even if it's not explicitly there, because there's so many connected things, it's like, we can't have a leader from this place, or who has had this life experience, who has, in the case of a female leader, maybe been out of work, been taken a year off to have a child, or whatever. Those kind of, even if we're not explicitly discriminating, we're kind of implicitly discriminating by saying a leader looks like this. And I think that perhaps, this knowing what you're doing really loops back round to like how confident we are in identifying the situation we're really in, and what we need and what we want in that situation, and how to engage, how to get that. And it feels like a lot of this, we have this sense of what a leader looks like. And I think certainly in this country, I think some of the significant political difficulties we've suffered are because some of the people in very senior leadership positions look like leaders. They have the surface level qualities of leadership without having the deeper qualities. And I think that relationship, that getting below the surface, of knowing, is like, on a surface level, do we know what we're doing? And how do we get below the surface of that? I think for me, that feels like a real, is like, yes, we might know on the surface, and yes, we might be able to say that, but how deep does that go?
Yeah. And how much do we dare to
And
let other perspectives and what ifs and what if nots into our decision-making program?
And I think it's worth saying, as someone who actually skews kind of my failure mode under pressure is in the opposite direction to this, is I fail in terms of like freeze because there's so many overwhelming possibilities rather than narrowing down and just monomaniacally doing one. And I think it's like, it is important to kind of have a sense of what we're doing. It is important to have some of this, but to hold it lightly and to hold it based on our level of certainty and based on having figured that out, and work, like, how certain are we? Are we at 100? That is like the understanding around the thing, the framing of the thing feels really, really an important part of, like, so there's knowing what you're doing on that specific level, and there's knowing like why you're doing it and in what context, and that they're just as important questions.
Yes, and it makes me think of a canvas that not knowing what you're doing at all on the micro and macro level just turns you into a headless chicken. But then knowing the restrictions, knowing what you can control, what you cannot control, as you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, then within this kind of framework, not knowing in detail, not being attached to the outcomes, I think that's a mindset that we could nurture that would help us in succeeding and being maybe a little bit less miserable in the everyday life.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that this is, there's a real joy in uncertainty. The opposite of uncertainty is knowing exactly what's going to happen. And that doesn't sound like much fun. Again, that's one of the things people often say they want, and actually, when you get certainty, it makes people really miserable. There's a whole range of unimagined, wonderful possibility, and that surprise, that joyful surprise, feels like, we lose out on so much of that, particularly at work.
Yes.
So, if someone wants to kind of explore this a bit further or engage with this, first of all, how could they get in touch with you or continue that conversation with you?
I think the best way is to connect on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and I think that's the easiest. Otherwise, I have a website that is totally outdated because of all the reasons we spoke about.
Me too.
Because workshops don't work. So LinkedIn is the best way.
Cool. We've got a link to the website, which I think has got a link to your LinkedIn. And there's also the podcast.
Yes. Workshops Work.
Yep, the Workshops Work podcast, which I was really, really happy to be a guest on, where we kind of talk about some kind of related stuff to this, I think. It was really, really lovely experience. And I think there's a whole load of different approaches and value there. And also, I'd really recommend anyone who's interested in visualization, particularly, to check out Myriam's podcast, because it has perhaps the coolest map to podcast topics that I have ever seen. It's really, really challenging to kind of locate people in some of the complex, when you talk about complex topics. And so if you're in this space at all, or you're podcasting, do check it out, just because I think it's really, really cool. We've also got a link to the community, because it might be quite helpful to talk about, like very briefly about why doing this in community is so important, because I found that as well. And I'd really like to hear from you, and like, with the community, a little bit more about that.
So I, by accident, unsurprisingly, I built a community that we call Never Done Before. And it's all about giving facilitators the opportunity to contribute, to test and experiment with workshops ideas in a way that they have never done before. And I think to be together in this liminal space between knowing and not knowing creates a sense of trust. And also, I think we need that just to grow the muscle. Because I realized the very first time that I did something for the first time, it feels quite scary. And now it's almost like a mindset. It's something that I just do. And if it goes wrong, it goes. It almost became my unique value proposition. Basically, if I say, okay, it's about the imperfect, and this invites, I think, it invites a very specific kind of person in, audience in, and creates a creates community with the audience immediately, because we're in this together, because we experience it together for the first time. Don't know whether I answered your question, but
I know, definitely. I think it's one of those challenging things, and I think these kind of communities of joint exploration are really an emerging thing. And my own community around this, as well as relates to, is a really important one. And I think finding, if you are given to a higher level than most people of this kind of like for uncertainty and skill for uncertainty, I think there's a very high chance you haven't had the chance to develop it, and that it may have even been punished or pushed, or you may have been pushed away for wanting to do that. And doing it in a space with other high-level practitioners is a really, really important way of both developing the skills and also in just satisfying ourselves when we always have to water it down, or mostly have to water it down so we don't scare others. And I think that, so I'd recommend, definitely, if you're, from the facilitation perspective, do check it out. And there's a link in the show notes as well to the community. So yeah. Cool. Are there any other further resources or anything else, books, websites, movies, podcasts, anything that kind of spring to mind at all? You mentioned the quantum dynamics.
Yes, Something Deeply Hidden is a book about many worlds and quantum physics, beyond the woo-woo. Because everyone speaks about quantum physics nowadays. They make a thought, and then a second personality arises in a parallel world, and this is not quantum physics. So those who are interested in weird thing, where it's not our decisions that create multiple worlds, but our anyway. This I can recommend.
I think relatedly, I find Richard Feynman was particularly adept at this kind of work, and his big piece of quantum electrodynamics. If you're willing to engage with physics and maths, because it's not really it's the most accessible book I've read on deep quantum mechanics, but that's not saying it's what you'd commonly call accessible. But I think those concepts, that kind of concrete engagement with uncertainty, is a really, really interesting kind of paradoxical thing, because you get the kind of rather ungrounded approach to this stuff, and it's like, well, no, there are some boundaries here. There are some things here. There are some things we can rely on, and some things that are concrete, or partially concrete, probabilistically concrete, and some things that aren't. And being able to differentiate the two, I think, is the really important one. So instead of being it's all known, we can predict it all, it's all whatever, or it's kind of all in our heads, or all completely made up, because they actually amount to the same thing. There's something that's far weirder and more exciting and interesting in the synthesis of those two.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's almost dangerous how scientifically proven concepts, although very abstract and uncertain as such, like quantum mechanics, quantum physics, get so diluted and simplified, and then used to promote an idea that is totally unrelated, and then everyone follows and believes that this is the thing. So I think it's even more important to then nurture the curiosity, and maybe sometimes do sit down to wrap the head around the real stuff.
And I think relatedly, in terms of further resources, is doing random creative stuff, because just whatever like works for you. Because I think that's also the really big one is, anything creative, music, dance, play, like it doesn't matter in terms of the specifics. Just being able to engage that is such an important part of this, I think.
I started ecstatic dance recently, which is maybe on the extreme. And I find it so liberating because there are basically three rules. One rule is you don't speak. There's no booze or no drugs, and there are no shoes. So everything is basically allowed, and you dance with yourself and the music and other people. And it's so liberating to be to have minimal structures and still to be free to connect to music. And there's another, so yes, do stuff, do creative stuff, and lastly, reach out to people. I think nowadays it's so easy, me included, it's so easy to connect to people on LinkedIn, to send them a message, to set up a call, even a longer call, and then to speak about it. I think it's never been so easy to allow new ideas, new connections into our life, to just enrich and maybe sometimes challenge our position.
And I think relating to knowing what we're doing, I've part of doing this podcast has been an ongoing kind of leaning into a sense of imposter syndrome, and a sense of like, why would anyone want to talk, come on this podcast and talk to me for an hour? It's like, I don't have I don't have the expertise in that. To talk to people who are experts in so many different things, and it's like, my experience is that actually being interested and really engaging, as long as you're, the interest is the most important thing, that curiosity. And when people sense genuine curiosity in you, they will engage in ways that never end surprising, so that they never end to surprising me.
Yes. And for me, the best example is Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, who had some of the most brilliant people on earth on his podcast. I mean, Elon Musk smoked a joint with him live on the podcast. And he used to be an MMA wrestler and a stand-up comedian. And he intrigues through his genuinely curious questioning. He asks all the questions that the audience might ask. And that's beautiful.
Yeah,
I think.
So I love that. Yeah, allowing your curiosity, as well as the knowing what you're doing.
Yeah. So need the same for my podcast. I don't do any research about my guests beforehand, so that I can just be the ignorant and curious investigator.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate this conversation and where it went. And there's a lot of stuff I'd like to kind of continue and follow up. So hopefully we'll get the chance to do that as well. But I really do suggest, everyone, if you're feeling similarly in the audience, please do reach out and get in touch, because it's great to continue this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I loved it. As always. More to follow. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you, and thank you in the audience for watching and for participating. It really is your support that makes this possible, or at very least legitimizes my random excuses to talk to interesting and wonderful people. So thank you all for watching. Please do engage, share this with anyone you think it might be helpful, and share your questions about it too. If it raises questions for you, then and you're thinking about something, you don't have to have we don't need to be sharing answers. Share the questions it raises for you. That would be wonderful. There are upcoming and past episodes available on YouTube and LinkedIn, and the podcast is available, though I'm afraid is still quite out of date. But if you search Delightful Dissent on your favourite podcast platform, you will find it there, and I'm hoping that we'll have the backlog of episodes up there reasonably soon. The next episode, I'm going to be talking to Sharon Lee, who is a multifaceted change facilitator, including being a behavioral scientist, an instructional designer, a neurodiversity evangelist, and more. And we are going to be talking about the idea that you should get certified. And I think this does really connect, it's really interesting how these kind of join together. We place so much value on this idea of qualification and getting qualified people in. But I think, what if we can't assess people for the situation that they're going to find ourselves in? What if we don't know what we want someone to do, really? And I think it's so I'm really looking forward to exploring that. And that will be recorded next week. Actually, the pattern's getting a little bit out of order, but so we'll be recording that next week at 1 p.m. UK time on Wednesday, the 20th of July. And I'd really love to see you there then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks very much, and goodbye.